बाप का हिंदुस्तान थोड़ी है.
So, as someone who comes from the south, the southern meal starts with the sweet.
It's a feeling that all Hindus hate Muslims and Muslims hate Hindus, and that they can never be part of one syncretic culture.
A Hindu never always votes as a Hindu, and somehow he didn't deem it fit to give the very same example with respect to others. Whether it's Babri Masjid or Gyanvapi Mandir or so on and so forth.
एक और नए वीडियो के साथ ऑल अबाउट फीलिंग्स में आपका स्वागत है. आज की वीडियो की टॉपिक है इंडिक हिस्ट्री, डिस्टॉर्टेड इंडिक हिस्ट्री. आई एम श्योर आपको इस वीडियो से काफ़ी नॉलेज मिलेगा, काफ़ी इन्फॉर्मेशन मिलेगा. हम सबको ही पता है कि हमारे भारतीय इतिहास को तोड़ मरोड़ के लोगों के सामने पेश किया गया. कहाँ से इसकी शुरुआत हुई, हम में से बहुत से लोग ही ये नहीं जानते हैं. यही सब चर्चा लेके ये वीडियो है. वीडियो में आपको दिखाई दे रहा है साई दीपक जी और मिस्टर पी.के. वर्मा जी. साई दीपक जी को तो आप बहुत सारे लोग ही जानते होंगे, यंगस्टर, खासकर यंगस्टर्स आप सभी लोग जानते होंगे. लेकिन पी.के. वर्मा जी को बहुत सारे लोग नहीं जानते हैं, जैसे कि मैं नहीं पहचानता था. पी.के. वर्मा जी कांग्रेस के राज्यसभा मेंबर हैं. वीडियो काफ़ी इंटरेस्टिंग होने वाला है, तो चलिए वीडियो शुरू करते हैं. वीडियो पे जाने से पहले जो लोग चैनल पे नए हैं, चैनल को सब्सक्राइब ज़रूर कर लेना. वीडियो अगर अच्छा लगे तो लाइक कीजिए, शेयर कीजिए, और अगर वीडियो बुरा लगे तो कमेंट करके बताइए.
And Mr. Sai Deepak, because a divergence was made between Nehru and the work of historians. Though Nehru had a deep antipathy towards Dr. Rajendra Prasad's proposal to go and inaugurate or reconstruct the Somnath temple, in a sense, as Dr. Sampath says, fossilize its rebirth or renaissance, reconstruction or what have you. How would that not have influenced the historians of the time or the makers of the syllabus of the time? Do you agree with this, or do you just believe that this was accidental? Some great minds worked and they came up with textbooks and they said it as it was.
I don't think it's that innocent. I'll give you perhaps a nugget. So, Roshan Seth, the actor, plays Nehru in Bharat Ek Khoj. And in the episode that speaks of Prithviraj Chauhan, it ends with a reference to Prithviraj Raso, which speaks of how Ghori was killed by a blinded Prithviraj Chauhan. And that's how that particular story ends. But Nehru's comment with respect to that particular ending is, this is perhaps make-believe. And I don't think this would have been the case. And that perhaps a defeated people are trying to invent fables and legends to assuage or mollify their own defeated sentiments. That seems to be the running train of Nehruvian thought across his works. And this is not, let's say, a sample position that you take out of context. This is his running thought. Now, I would agree with Mr. Khurshid if assume for a moment two sets of scholars with divergent opinions were equally patronized for their positions in scholarship. And then the public had an opportunity to consume both points of view and to determine which of these is more evidence-based, which of these is more consistent with the immediate incident of the partition or the ghastly episode of the partition, and which of these is more believable, what is it that we would like to draw lessons from. Now, it so happens that a particular line of historians were completely kept outside the pale of the establishment. R.C. Majumdar, Jadunath Sakkar, all of these people who were comfortable presenting uncomfortable truths were relegated to the margins. So therefore, it's not as if all historians who were willing to present a certain point of view were given an opportunity. So I'm not willing to buy that. Second, assume for a moment that the ghastly specter of partition hadn't taken place and we were still living in an undivided, united India. I would still buy the premise to some extent that why would you want to dig up an uncomfortable past when somehow after 1,000 years of bloodshed, two major communities have managed to find peace to live with each other, alongside each other as part of a single nation. But after the partition, on the basis of a two-nation theory, which clearly has a religious basis, what mythical unity are you trying to build and what mythical peace are you trying to build after millions of people have already lost their lives and Bharat has lost about 30% of its land, so to speak, at the very least? So what is this unity that you're trying to build on the altar of falsified history? I can understand that there's an incentive to build this unity and this peace building initiative, provided the partition hadn't taken place. But after the partition, at the very least, the government has an obligation to place historical facts. Allow people to come forward and say that this is what has happened, there is a continuum as far as this particular mindset is concerned, and there cannot be a repeat of this particular mindset for the benefit of our own people. Now, I am not willing for a moment to buy the fact that the exodus, the forced exodus of Kashmiri Pandits from Kashmir, has nothing to do with the mindset that resulted in the partition. I am unable to buy that particular fact. Therefore, this is not an archival study in the past. It is as much a study of an ongoing present, which is going to repeat itself, or at least, at the very least, is repeating itself across several parts of the country. Therefore, I don't think history is merely a question of looking back, learning certain lessons and moving forward. Because if it were that easy, why would you have placards with respect to Aryan invasion theory at every protest relating to a reservation? So history remains relevant to every contemporary discussion, unfortunately or fortunately so. Then we might as well ensure that there is a plurality of voices. So here's one suggestion that I make. And this is on the basis of my discussion with several historians. And I hope Dr. Vikram Sampath weighs in on this. Perhaps history should be taken away from the realm of the government altogether, and let there be a body of independent experts who are in a position to arrive at some kind of consensus with respect to what kind of curriculum needs to be presented in school syllabi. This happens in other countries. We seem to be learning the worst of principles from the West. But the best of principles also means independent actors and independent experts on subject matter, they come together and they formulate the study. And parents are invited for their inputs on whether you want this particular thing to be presented as school curriculum, so on and so forth. That's a suggestion that's possible. But you see, the so-called non-left in this country would still be comfortable with that particular suggestion. But those who believe that history needs to be utilized to perpetuate a particular myth about this particular country as a defeated society and as a defeated nation would never want to let go of any kind of control over history as a domain and humanities as a domain. That's been the reality. As someone who has spent a significant amount of time talking to students across campuses in several lectures, this much I can vouch for a fact, that history is a real battleground. And that means it translates to policy making, it translates to curriculum, it translates to legal education, it translates to all kinds of submissions being made even before the Supreme Court of the land. I'm sure you followed the arguments that were presented as part of the EWS case before the Supreme Court. I would say that was a textbook instance of Nehruvian distorted history being mainstreamed through arguments before the highest court of the land. And I was very happy that people could finally see what kind of versions of history have actually been bought lock, stock and barrel by members of the establishment, so the so-called Nehruvian establishment, and what is being presented to oppose the EWS. I'm not on the question of EWS, but on how history was weaponized in the Supreme Court during the course of a policy discussion. So I'm very clear that history is never going to be free of contestation. I'm only hoping that people have the courage of their conviction and the honesty to wear their biases on their sleeve and allow the evidence to speak for itself, so that the public can ask itself whether the bias prevails over the evidence or the evidence prevails over the bias. That's something for people to decide. That's what I'm here for. Past. So as someone who comes from the south, the southern meal starts with the sweet. So let me start with a point of agreement with Mr. Verma. On the aspect of colonization and on the impact of colonization, I don't think I have anything to disagree with at all. That it has much more pernicious and far more, let's say, far-reaching effects than the use of the sword. I completely agree with on that. And I think we are still reeling from the impact of it, which is very clear. I don't think we are wearing the Mughal clothes. We are wearing the clothes of the British man for all practical purposes, at least some of us. So therefore, I understand that particular issue. But this much is clear from the points made by Mr. Khurshid and Mr. Verma, that one believes that that was a wave of migration, and the other is clear, citing material, that this was not a migration, this was a bloody invasion, as bloody as it could get in the history of humankind. Now, this is what I wish to highlight to make one point. To choose to observe a strategic silence in the interest of peace is very different from actively indulging in denial of history. And that's exactly where the problem starts. So if an entire school is established that goes about whitewashing stuff as opposed to saying, let's not touch this particular aspect of history, which I think is also not possible. How do you choose to remain silent over one particular aspect of your history? That's not going to happen. So then the only option is to speak about it. Now, why should the discussion with respect to something that has happened in the past result in acrimony in the present, unless someone relates to the invader even in the present and someone does not relate to the invader even in the present? In which case, the two-nation theory is well alive and kicking. That's one. But factually speaking, one particular trope I think needs to be busted because I think it's been sold well beyond its sell-by date. I'm sorry to say, after partition, people did not choose to stay here. The elections prior to the partition of 1946 spoke volumes. And that's a very clear decision taken at the ballot. And therefore, when you choose to speak about history, let's be clear that perhaps practical considerations came into existence which prevented a mass migration, but certainly not patriotic considerations or Bharatiya considerations. I think that myth needs to be busted, and we cannot sell it any further. 3. On Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb, well, while I have several reservations with Dr. Ambedkar, the one thing that he was crystal clear about in his book, Pakistan or the Partition of India, which was published on the eve of the partition, 2 books were published by Rajendra Prasad in 1946 and Dr. Ambedkar in 1946, in which he clearly says that the so-called Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb, or the syncretic culture that is celebrated over and over again, is a product of the incomplete conversion of the converted Hindu to Islam. And therefore, multiple waves of attempts have been made on a regular basis to remove the remnants of that Hinduness from that particular convert, which is what has been pushed in this country as what we know as Wahhabism. To say that the new convert shall identify himself with the early converts to Islam, and therefore you cannot have any ties whatsoever or any cultural practices whatsoever which remind you of your ancestor. That starts with the language, that moves to dressing, so on and so forth. So let's be clear. If acrimony is the result or is going to be the result of a discussion with respect to the medieval period in current day Bharat and contemporary Bharat, that is because there are still people who relate to this particular person or this particular. Had that not been the case, why should there be a resistance with respect to the reclamation of a particular, let's say, structure that was built by an invader? Whether it's Babri Masjid or Gyanvapi Mandir or so on and so forth, these were built by invaders. Obviously, they were not built after the independence of this particular country. This is not a structure that has come into existence after 15th of August 1947. Why do you relate to this particular structure? Because the mindset that has been imposed on you at the peril of the sword and let's say at the pain of death prevents you from accepting your past, and therefore it's going to be a constant tussle each time there's a discussion with respect to the past. So I refuse to buy the fact that history is no more relevant or that it's possible for us to have these discussions objectively. I agree with Mr. Verma on this point. It cannot be objective. That's exactly why I concluded my first opening submission by saying all of us have our biases. It's impossible for us to say that we don't have biases. We are human beings, impossible. We may choose not to bring out certain proclivities and, let's say, ideological leanings to the fore for reasons of pragmatism, whatever it may be. But let the evidence speak for itself. But if the evidence leads to a different conclusion and it has consequences on the street or elsewhere, then the people who choose to resort to the street merely because truth is being presented in a public forum are to be blamed. History is not to be blamed, and certainly not those people who wish to present that version of history before the public.
We need to be honest about our past. But equally, we need maturity, wisdom, inclusion, and reconciliation today. I genuinely say that because I think we will be violating one of the strongest tenet of Indic faiths, which is that this world is one of inclusion. I mean, the Mahavakya is Vasudev Kutumbakam. Ano Bhadrah Kritavo Yantu Vishnu.
इतना बुरा दिन आ गया है कि लिबरल लोगों से महावाक्य सुनना पड़ रहा है. चलिए.
Let good thoughts flow from all directions. Let us not attack the Indic faiths by making them clones of what has happened to theocratic states elsewhere. That takes away the unique distinction of India, which is a plural republic. And I want to say that somewhere from what the comments made, I think there is a feeling that all Hindus hate Muslims and Muslims hate Hindus, and that they can never be part of one syncretic culture.
मेरे हिसाब से वर्मा जी जो कह रहे हैं आधा सच आधा झूठ। इस्लाम में है कि काफिर कभी आपका दोस्त नहीं बन सकता। काफिर मतलब इस्लाम छोड़ के और जो भी सब पंथ अपनाने वाले जो भी हैं, खासकर हिंदू, हिंदू है काफिर। कोई भी मुस्लिम हिंदुओं से प्यार नहीं कर सकता, नहीं करता, जितना भी बड़ा मुस्लिम हो जाए। अगर कोई एथिस्ट है तो अलग बात है, एथिस्ट, आई एम सॉरी, लेकिन वो करोड़ों में एक मिलता है। जैसे कि हमारे पूर्व राष्ट्रपति कलाम साहब, करोड़ों में एक, वो कोई आम इंसान नहीं था, ही वॉज अ जेम। और हिंदू कभी भी किसी से भी नफरत नहीं कर सकता, नहीं करता, लेकिन आज हिंदू नफरत करने के लिए मजबूर है, ये मेरा मानना है।
I don't believe it's true, because if it was true, a party which was speaking, let us say disproportionately or only for Hindus, would have won every election. But our surveys show that even in the moments of the maximum polarization on the basis of religion, post Godhra, Babri Masjid, or most recently in West Bengal, the elections, not more than 50% Hindus vote only because they are Hindus. So there is already in our DNA.
ये बात नोट कर लीजिएगा। अगर हम सब लोग इन लोगों की तरह सोचने लगे तो हिंदुस्तान हिंदुस्तान नहीं रहेगा, इस्लामिस्तान बन जाएगा। बंगाल देख रहे हैं, जम्मू देख लिया, कश्मीर, अभी केरला देख रहे हैं, केरला और भी बहुत सारा है। आसाम में देखिए ना, बॉर्डर के पास हिंदू एक भी फैमिली नहीं है। क्यों नहीं है? वो सब वीरान जगह थी, बाहर से आके बैठ गया कांग्रेस के टाइम पे। बांग्लादेश से रोहिंग्याज कहाँ से आते हैं सब, बॉर्डर एरिया में आके वीरान जगहों पे बैठ गया। अभी उनका वोटर बन गया है, आधार बन गया है, उन लोगों का कोई उठा नहीं सकता है। बंगाल के मतलब बंगाल के जितने भी वीरान जगह थी, और हम हिंदुओं को शर्म नहीं आती है, कुछ चंद पैसों के लिए हम लोग जगह बेच देते हैं। किसको बेचते हैं? मुस्लिम को। और उसी जगह पे बैठ के वो लोग हम लोगों को ख़त्म करने के बारे में सोचता है, हमारे ही जगह पे बैठ के। चलिए सुनिए।
A sense of an inclusive republic.
Okay.
And let us keep it like that. I'm reminded, although I'm reluctant to say it, Sai, of Rahat Indori's line, सभी का खून शामिल है यहाँ की मिट्टी में, किसी के बाप का हिंदुस्तान थोड़ी है।
Can I just make one point?
Okay,
Just one
okay, one final, two closing comments. Okay.
I'm happy that Mr. Verma deemed it fit to point out that a Hindu never always votes as a Hindu. And somehow he didn't deem it fit to give the very same example with respect to others. Now I leave that decision to him. See, the point is this. You have two variables in the equation, facts and tone. Let us present facts, but not necessarily in a violent tone. My submission is this. Do not create, let's say, ghosts. To prevent the presentation of facts, the focus of the law, even when facts is presented before the public platform, is in what tone is a particular fact presented. Because if it is grating, then the tone alone is sufficient for invoking the law. So therefore, I am saying let the tone be peaceful, let the tone be one of reconciliation, but let there be no compromise on facts. As long as we agree on that, I think there's a meeting ground to be met.
देखिए, मेरे हिसाब से ये वीडियो काफ़ी नॉलेजेबल था। मेरे हिसाब से आप लोगों को क्या लगता है कमेंट पे बताइए। तो वीडियो देखने के लिए धन्यवाद। मिलते हैं अगले वीडियो में।